Okay, any questions?
I have the mic.
Any questions?
Bhante, where does Cetasika mental formations fall into this? We see the form, or the base is open, we see the form. How does this...
Where do the mental factors fit in?
Right.
This sutta doesn't specifically mention the mental factors, but we could understand, of course, feeling is one mental factor. And then in what's called mental exploration, vitaka and vichara, applied thought and sustained thought, or thought and examination, those would be mental factors. And so, of course, the mental factors are there, but this isn't, in that respect, this isn't an Abhidhamma text which is concerned with analyzing mental factors and classifying them. So the mental factors are sort of left a little bit on the sidelines as a particular class. Does somebody else have?
One other question before. And you talk, one of the doors or the bases would be...
I think it's...
one of the bases would be consciousness. One of the objects is consciousness. But how does consciousness reference or observe consciousness? Can you talk a little bit about that?
This was a point of, again, this issue isn't brought up directly for discussion in the suttas, though the Buddha speaks, for example, about mindfulness of the mind. So citta is one of the objects of mindfulness in the four foundations of mindfulness. But the issue isn't brought up, or that type of question doesn't come up in the suttas themselves. And so it became a bit of like a point of controversy and different opinions amongst the different schools of Buddhism. So according to, the Theravada Abhidhamma system, the commentaries, and probably most of the mainstream schools, even the Madhyamaka school, says that it's impossible for one state of consciousness to observe itself while it's occurring simultaneously. So what is taking place, and then they use the example, it's just as it's impossible for a finger to touch itself, or it's impossible for a knife to cut itself. So one state of consciousness cannot know itself as it's actually occurring. So when it seems that we're observing the mind, what is actually occurring at sort of the microscopic level is that there's a rapid succession of processes of consciousness. And so the state of consciousness which is doing the observation is a later state of consciousness, but still in close proximity to the earlier state of consciousness that was observing a particular a sense object or undergoing a particular emotion. And so, for example, in the Satipatthana Sutta, when it said, when the mind has lust, one knows the mind has lust. Okay, so the mind that's observing there is lust is not that state of mind that's doing the observing or that's exercising the mindfulness is not actually the state of mind with the lust, but it's following sort of in the shadow or trail of that, so that, they seem to be simultaneous, but there's actually a very brief temporal difference between the two. So this was sort of what I call the mainstream Buddhist position. But then there was another school, I think this was the school of Dignaga and Dharmakirti. It's called like the logical school. they came up with the idea, it's called Svadvedana, which means Sva is self, Vedana, experiencing, that every consciousness also experiences itself at the same time that it's having the experience of an object. And this is said to be the basis for... I think, this is supposed to be a general question and answer period rather than a... Of course, if we want to have a panel discussion, Samudin in dialogue with Bihu Modi. Richard had something to say. Oh wait, Stephen, did you have a question? Yeah, you have the mic. Let's you. I don't think the microphone is working. Maybe.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay.
I have a question about the 6 kinds of grief based on renunciation.
Yeah.
Are these to be looked at as positive things? Because I wonder if this sort of points to a little bit about the wanting of enlightenment or the wanting of some sort of attainment, which of course leads to a sense of lack while you're wanting it.
Yeah. Again, it's an interesting question for discussion. Technically, in the Abhidhamma, domanassa is said to be the basis always for unwholesome states of consciousness. And in this case, the domanassa arises from wanting something that one hasn't obtained or feeling disappointed for one's failure to obtain something. So in that sense, technically it would be have to be classified as unwholesome, but in a sense it's a push in the it's an unwholesome which is pushing in the wholesome direction. So it's a kind of beneficial thing, and I believe, if I remember what I read last night, and what we didn't get, we'll come to next week, is that it said that depending upon the 6 folds, here I have sorrow or displeasure based on renunciation, abandon the 6-fold sorrow based on the household life. So even though this sorrow or displeasure for failing to get what one obtains might be called unwholesome technically, but it's can be viewed positively because it's removing one from the sorrow based upon worldly desire towards the desire for spiritual realizations.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, now we can pass down to Richard.
Yeah, it strikes me that the first Abhidhamma school, right, has an assumption that you can only be conscious of one thing at a time, but it doesn't seem to be stating the basis of that assumption.
Yeah.
It strikes me it's really a kind of you can't walk and chew gum at the same time school, right? And and then the second school says, well, you can walk and know you're walking at the same time.
Yeah.
But it's not really saying you can walk and chew gum at the same time, right? It seems to me that there's plenty of evidence that you can do at least 3 things at once. That is, you can walk and chew gum and know that you're walking and chewing gum at the same time, right? I mean, I don't see any problem myself with believing that I know what's in my visual field at the same time that I'm hearing something, right? And that I may be hearing something that has nothing...
Wait just a second, my attention was deflected by... And I can't listen to 2 sounds at the same time.
But then how do you listen to a symphony?
Yeah, I mean, with so many instruments playing at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you may have 100 instruments in a symphony.
It's one
You
massive
can't hear them
sound.
all separately, but you certainly can hear them. Mozart, he'd go to a concert when he was 5 years old. He'd come back and he'd write down every note. Sometimes when there are like 8 parts going at once, he remembered them all distinctly, right? So now how do you describe Mozart's consciousness then?
I have to say, it seems to me that this scholastic or Abhidhammic way of treating consciousness is an oversimplification. I believe that the mind is really like there's a name for these kind of is that what they call it, parallel processes?
Oh, okay.
Johnny is in the computer field. Yeah, so that it can actually really process several things going on at the same time. But what they would say, I'm taking the standpoint of, the strict Abhidhammika about your walking and chewing gum. And both actions are formed by intention, by volition. So, because when you're chewing gum, each time you're making an intentional effort to chew down on the ball of gum. And also, as you're walking, you're making an intentional effort to take each step. So what they would say is that if you put the mind series under a psychic microscope, you'll see that there are alternating or altering thought processes. With one thought process, one is making the determination, squeeze down on the gum. With another thought process occurring a few microseconds after, you're having the volition lift the right foot. Then another volitional process, relax the jaws on the gum. Another volitional process, bring the right foot forward.
But that doesn't explain how you are able to track each of them. It just makes an added complication, because if the events have to be discrete and separate, then you have to explain how you're able to get from one event in your jaw to the next event in your jaw when it's interfered with by the event with your foot.
Yeah.
Right? Which just seems to make it more complex.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, as I said, that it seems to me that this perspective on the mind as being able to exercise only one volition at any moment is an oversimplification of what
But that's not a question of consciousness, that's a question of volition. For instance, what if your stomach is growling at the same time? Because your peristaltic processes is getting noisy. Well, that's not volitional, and yet you can notice it.
Okay.
Right? And so consciousness has to be distinct from volition.
I use volition, but I would apply the same thing to consciousness. Like I'm seeing you and hearing you at the same time. Of course, again, the Abhidhammika would say that what's going on at the microscopic level is that there are, very, very evanescent process by which I see your image, then in almost immediate succession, another process by which I hear your voice.
Yeah, but that's an inference. It's not an observation.
Yeah.
That is, it's an inference, and it's an inference without the stated assumptions.
Yeah, I mean, I admit that,
So, okay.
Yeah, Bowe had a question.
Bhante, I have a question about paragraph 8. Just that sentence, when seeing a form with the eye, one explores a form productive of joy and so forth. But before I ask my question, I need to say something about the first several class of my English grammar class, our English grammar told us when she explains the difference between definite article and indefinite article, she said, if I say once upon a time there is a king, and then the second time you would say the king, THE. So I wonder, the first form is the same as the second form. Otherwise, we would say, when seeing a form with the eye, one explores the form, THE. So is the second form the pretty girl, or is the second form, does the second form refer to the person who is observing? Otherwise, how come the second form starts with A? So it's one form and not exactly the same person, the same form.
One seeing a form with the eye.
Right. And
On seeing a form with the eye, one explores a form productive of joy.
So what does the second form refer to? Is the same as the first one, or the?
Yeah. The form productive of joy is the form that one is seeing with the eye.
So how come it's not the form? Like we say, once upon a time there is a king, and the king does this, did this and that. So the second form, could it be possible the person who is observing? So otherwise, what's the use, the purpose of observing another person's form all the time? Basically, it's about the practitioner himself or herself. So if the second form is the practitioner himself, no, it's not possible at
It's
all?
speaking about an external object.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so when on seeing a form, let's just make it very simple. On seeing a patch of grass, or the green of a patch of grass. Okay, on seeing a form with the eye, one explores a form productive of joy. So the form that's productive of joy is the patch of green grass that I'm seeing with the eye. It's not referring to anything else.
So it cannot be the form, the physical form of the practitioner, which
No.
is generated by his mind.
No. It's the form that's the object of the eye,
Then how come it's not the form?
not the form.
THE, the second form, why is not like
Well, the Pali doesn't use pronouns, and yeah, it's just has rupang without any pronoun. Yeah. Yeah, it's just describing a very general case. Okay, Tracy?
This might be beyond today's discussion, but I'm wondering about the transition from householder to renunciate. Like,
Yeah.
how does renunciation arise?
Mm.
It seems like we're so conditioned,
Yeah,
and yet there has to be a space
yeah.
where renunciation can appear. Does this model offer insight about that?
Yeah, I mean, what you say is true, but the sutta isn't concerned with that process here, but it's really just setting up sort of a contrast or a dichotomy in order to show, well, the difference in the distinctive quality of the joy, displeasure, equanimity associated with called worldliness, or with worldly attachment, and the joy, sorrow, displeasure, equanimity connected with renunciation or with liberation. But there are other suttas which deal with, many other suttas with making the transition from one to the other. Did you have Edwin?
Yeah.
And then Allison.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, well, actually, I'm going further into the chapter, but this is based on depending on this, abandon that. In other words, if you depend on that, then you abandon that. Isn't that what is getting to the final of chapter? You know, what, I mean, we haven't got there yet, but that's why there's the confusion, that we have to, by depending on this,
Yeah.
you abandon that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So therefore, is what he's saying is if you depend on one thing, right, which
Yeah.
is equanimity, actually the household, then you abandon that. Equanimity goes into the meditative state.
Yeah.
Isn't that would be answering this? I mean, the 36 positions of beings,
Yeah.
would it be?
Are you presenting this as an answer to Tracy's question? Or-
Yeah, I'm just thinking that maybe that's where the confusion comes in, that the end of the chapter is explaining the 36 of positions of beings is actually depending on this, abandon that. So it's going back into saying by depending on this, equanimity,
Yeah.
you let go of household life, and then you go into renunciation.
Let me just take another look at that. I mean, there is, in the next part of the sutta,
Right.
a process of, how do I put this? A process of refinement, of moving from, or of making a transition from one to the other.
Right.
Though the sutta itself doesn't explain the steps by which one makes that transition. I think, and she was asking about the steps or process by which one makes that transition.
Okay.
Worldly feeling. Because there's still, okay, depending on the sixfold joy based on renunciation, abandon the sixfold joy based on the household life.
Right, so you abandon
Actually,
that.
maybe you could even see that as a way of, of making that transition. Yeah. Though it's not explored in any detail, but it's, if one draws out the full implications.
Mhm.
And then Allison had a question, then Sam, then Poe.
Bhante, would you not think that, breaking these into the householder and the renunciate is a little redundant because the underlying joy, displeasure, and indifference are the three states, and a person who's a householder and can get to that state is not as good as a renunciate who is at that state?
Did
I mean,
you come a little bit late?
I did probably, yeah.
Yeah. What I explained when I introduced these terms is that even though it uses the term the household life, or literally is geha nisita, depending upon the home or the house, and then that's contrasted with renunciation. I said that we shouldn't interpret this in terms of the polarity of the householder or layperson versus the monk
Right.
or monastic, but sort of these are just maybe figures of speech indicating that which is on the side of attachment or bondage to the worldly life, and that which is on the side of detachment, renunciation, the move in the direction of liberation. So it's not but sort of necessarily tying these to conceptions of particular individual types of persons, but it's using this as sort of general categories to indicate the nature of this joy, displeasure, and equanimity.
Right, thanks.
Okay, we were moving.
Hi, Bhante, I have a question regarding to the contact you're talking about. I'd like to have a clear definition. When you say contact, in order to have a contact formed, had to have a sangati, three things together.
Yeah,
Okay, and you said object, sense door, and in verbally you said corresponding consciousness.
Yeah.
And in page 203, it says the example is use I, and you say I consciousness.
Yeah.
And so I have two questions regarding to this definition of a contact. One is, in each of these three, does one person have to be, what role is playing? Is it active role, active to look for the object, or is it not active to look for the object? Each of these three things. And corresponding consciousness, I want to know is only corresponding to the object and the sense. In other words, if the object is I consciousness, if it's only corresponding to the I consciousness, then what's the next step to create the feelings? So I'm thinking about, I want a definition. When you corresponding consciousness, are you talking about singular consciousness or a stream of consciousness after that three together? I hope I asked the question clearly.
Okay, the first question was, when you're speaking about the arising of eye consciousness or eye contact, is this something which happens to one in a passive role, or in the case where one is actively seeking the particular object? That's the question?
Yes, I'd like to know whether it's actively looking for an object.
Yeah.
And if it's yes, then...
Wait, first, let me answer that question. The text doesn't specify. So we could take it probably that it's speaking about the case where this happens to the person in a relatively passive role, where some object impinges upon the sense faculty and initiates the process of cognition. But it can also apply to a case where one actively seeks something. But the most basic level is where one is the passive recipient of the experience. Okay, the second question now was?
Can I follow the answer of your first question? Okay, then it's okay. The second
you want
question.
to come up and sit?
No. The second question is
you've knocked out Sam, and now a dialogue.
The second question is when you are explaining to us, it's coming together. The three things have to come together. You use these two words. You use these two words. Use corresponding consciousness.
Yeah.
Okay. In page 203,
you
use example. You say I and form and I consciousness. But here is a singular consciousness, right? But in order, my mind, the way I process, in order for me to see an object and go to the sense door and to go to I consciousness, the next thing for me to create the feelings, I definitely have another consciousness is to like or dislike, and then creates the feeling. So I wonder the corresponding consciousness, is that a stream of consciousness or just a singular?
Okay, I understand. Okay, when I use the term corresponding consciousness, what I mean is that in the case of a the I in visible form, there is the I consciousness. Then I said, and so for the corresponding types of consciousness, that is when there's an ear, a sound in the ear, then it'll be ear consciousness, nose and smell, nose and an odor, nose consciousness, and so on. So what I mean is that the consciousness corresponds to the object and the sense door. Okay, then your point that when you experience the form that occurs on one occasion, then it takes the process goes on for some time, then you have the feeling, and then after that you have what? Okay, okay. Yeah.
From the contact to next stage of
Okay,
feelings.
okay, okay.
It's not just only
Yeah,
it's not
okay.
just simply the three together
Yeah, okay.
and then creates
Okay,
a feeling.
I understood. Okay, now what, I think we could say this even from the suttas, certainly from the Abhidhamma, one would say that on the occasion when the barest, simplest eye consciousness takes place, there is, along with the consciousness, there's the contact. Along with that contact, simultaneously, there's the feeling, there's a perception, there's some volition. So those are all occurring simultaneously. But it might be that because the sight of the object, the perception of the object is more prominent at the very beginning, so the feeling might be somewhat subdued and lying in the background, so that you're not distinctly aware of the feeling that you're experiencing when you're seeing the form. And then it seems that the feeling first appears maybe a little bit later as you're continuing to look at the form or reflecting on it. But what's happening is that there are a succession of processes of consciousness, and in later ones, the feeling is becoming more prominent. And so now you become clearly aware of the feeling, but the feeling was present already from the start. It's just that the feeling sort of gains momentum. Wait, let me continue. Okay, then maybe based upon that feeling, then at a later occasion, you explore or investigate the form that's the basis for that feeling.
So the feeling comes later, but you mentioned it. The consciousness, all the things that happen simultaneously.
Right.
All right.
The feeling becomes prominent later, but the feeling is already present from the start, from the first moment of consciousness.
So it looked like it's
And the feeling,
latent.
excuse me?
It looked like latent,
Yeah.
but it will show up later.
Yeah. And the feeling can actually change, like at the initial moment of sensory awareness or sensory consciousness, the feeling could be neutral because you're not at that point distinctly aware of what you're seeing. But as you focus in and recognize it or dwell upon it, then maybe either a joyful feeling or a feeling of displeasure will arise and displace that neutral feeling.
Thank you.
Hi. A little bit related to her question. I'm just curious, when does the subjective experience of something happen? So,
Say again?
when does the subjective experience of something happen? So, contact is the coming together, say, of,
Yeah.
For instance, eye consciousness,
Yeah.
the object, and
Yeah.
what is the third thing?
The sense faculty.
The sense, right. So, at the moment of contact, is there the subjective experience of, say, the color blue?
Excuse me?
At the moment of contact,
Yeah.
does the subjective experience of, say, the color blue arise?
Okay. Yeah, at the
Okay.
moment of contact,
Okay.
which is the moment of consciousness, there'll be the cognizing, the consciousness, say, in your case, of a
Okay.
blue objective field.
Which is I'm a little bit confused, though, when you say the moment of consciousness. Because contact supposedly is the coming together of consciousness, which
Yeah.
already existed.
Well, actually, this is
Yeah.
an interesting point. The text seems to be saying that consciousness is there before contact takes place.
Right.
But actually, looking at it in terms of conditionality, when consciousness arises, contact is present.
Okay.
There's no case of consciousness existing prior to contact. but the two are they're called mutuality conditions or reciprocity conditions. The two are supporting each other from the start.
Okay. I thought maybe consciousness was the capacity to have subjective experience, but
No, here it's being used in the sense
Okay.
of the actual knowing,
the experience
experiencing
itself.
of an
Yeah,
object.
okay.
Yeah.
All right, thanks.
If you think you want to share it with the group, you can.
Yeah, about the sequence. In imaginative experience, there are a lot of different possible sequences. You can have a feeling first and then attach an image to it.
Yeah.
Right? You could have a thought first and then attach a feeling or an
Yeah.
image. You could have a a concept or a volition.
Yeah.
That is, when you imaginatively you rearrange those
Yeah.
sequences
Yeah.
in all kinds of ways.
Yeah, I mean, that I know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's all.
Yeah, I
that's all
just
was
used
saying.
one particular example, but there are all
Yeah.
sorts of interrelationships possible between them.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, Sam, and then we'll have to call it quits unless somebody has a really urgent, irresistible question or comment.
Before you were talking about the mind can only process one of the objects or from the doors or the bases at a time. But
Yeah.
that was quite evident because when the alarm went off, you stopped listening to Richard.
No, but I was hearing both at the same time initially.
Yeah, but hearing and listening are two
But
different
my
things.
sort of, because of my concern, maybe there's a fire someplace. It seemed to be a fire alarm. So I was thinking maybe there's a fire taking place. So it's just that my concern sort of pushed my attention to Rich's remarks out. It's not that I wasn't
you
capable of hearing the two simultaneously.
Priority comes into the play somewhere along with the consciousness too, safety or whatever, self-preservation.
Yeah, of course.
But walking and chewing gum, even when we slow it down and we do walking meditation,
Yeah.
if you pay attention to the foot as
Yeah.
it's lifting,
Yeah.
you can pay attention to the breath at the same time and so on and so forth. It has to be one. I don't see how it could possibly be. It's happening at milliseconds. So there's no way to process something cognitively or lucidly if we're processing it all at the same time, concurrently.
This I'm not so sure. Sort of the orthodox position, as I said, is that one could only, again, it's easier to state this in terms of volition rather than knowing. So the traditional or orthodox position is that one volition at a time, and so when one is chewing down on the gum, one cannot be lifting the foot. When one is lifting the foot, one cannot be pressing down or relaxing the jaw to chew the gum. And I mean, what one notices if one is doing very intensive mindfulness meditation, we actually practice like breaking a step down and to 6 or to 8 phases so that you could see in each step that you're lifting, bringing the foot up to its, lifting the foot, bringing it forward to the point where it's equal with the other foot and extending the foot in front, putting it down, pressing it down. And so when it's breaking the step down into these places, and when you're doing it with mindfulness, then you see that you're exercising each volition separately. But maybe this is because one is adopting this particular pose or particular method of mindfulness, and so for this reason, one is exercising each volition separately. But I took a walk this morning, and if you ask me how many volitions was I aware of?
But that's exactly it too, Bhante. There's voluntary and involuntary. We don't tell ourselves to breathe, or we're not even conscious that we're breathing or walking.
Yeah,
If
of
I
course,
say
well, breathing occurs without any volitional effort at all, but it would seem that each step that I take is the function of a choice that I make to take that step. And if it's a function of a choice, then there has to be a volition behind it.
one last thing. How can you have consciousness first or concurrently if there's nothing to refer to? Can you have, you can't have consciousness without cause or condition, right?
Whoever said that there's consciousness without cause or condition?
What is there to reference? How can I know something is red if I've never seen red before?
I don't understand the question.
How can we have knowledge, consciousness, mind, if we don't have anything to reference back to?
Yeah, I mean, I understand the question, but I don't quite understand the relevance. Let me take Richard's question, then we'll stop for the day.
There are people who specialize in these things, like there are jazz musicians who play in 13/17 time.
Who play in?
13/17 time, meaning 13 beats with the left hand while the right hand is doing 17 beats. So that it keeps on, so that the relationship just keeps on changing. There are people you can watch drummers who are using their one with their right hand, one with the left hand, and then same with both feet. And I mean, this is many people's profession, and it's something that people train themselves in, and they can. There are lots of people who do all kinds of extraordinary things like that.
Not only that, but there's a creature. I saw it in Sri Lanka. I don't know whether we have it in it. Well, we have centipedes in this country with 1,000 legs.
Yeah, right.
In Sri Lanka, there's one called the millipede, which has 1,000 legs.
Yes.
I don't know whether it's literal or just.
No, it just means more than 100.
But it might have several hundred legs.
The centipedes are more poisonous than the millipedes.
Yeah, the millipedes are not poisonous at all. But if I teach that poor millipede to be mindful of walking.
I think there's a Lewis Carroll poem like that, right? But the thing is, it seems to me that with things like that, it is obvious that consciousness can be layered. That is, you can have one thing going on in focal consciousness, while nevertheless you're